Today's story is so quietly powerful, it might leave you sitting in silence long after it ends, set deep in the dusty stillness of the Old West, where the desert wind carries secrets across miles of empty land. It's a place where danger and destiny often cross paths without warning. And it all began with something small, one stubborn teacher riding out into the desert to find a missing child, not knowing that a single decision would change two lives forever. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun lay flat and heavy across the stone mesa when Lyra Boone stood facing the warriors and said in broken Apache that she was not afraid to die. She had practiced those words for 3 nights straight. She knew the sound of them was wrong. The middle consonant softened where it should have been sharp, and her tone climbed when it should have dropped low. Still the words came out. They carried on a steady voice she pulled from somewhere beneath the fear pressing against her ribs. When the sentence left her lips, the 5 men standing before her went completely still. Silence can take different shapes. This one felt hard, hot, like sun-baked stone. They knew her as Lyra Boone, a woman from a Tennessee town that no longer existed the way it once had. Her father, Abram Boone, had died of fever 3 years earlier. Her mother, Miriam Boone, had remarried a man named Horace Flint, a man who had little patience for children who asked too many questions. Lyra was 24. Her hair carried the faded shine of old copper. Her eyes were gray, not the pale gray of rain clouds, but the warmer gray of ash, where an ember might still live beneath the surface. Her mouth was wide, and her jaw had the quiet firmness of someone who learned early that tears rarely change what has already been decided. She had come to the Arizona Territory the previous October. She'd taken a job teaching English and arithmetic to the children at Fort Hadley, a position most women with better prospects would have avoided. Lyra had accepted it without hesitation. And now she stood alone before 5 Soren warriors, a full day's ride from the fort, hat clutched in her hand, her heart beating, where in places a heart ought not to beat. She had left the fort the morning before to search for a runaway child, a girl named Tiva. Tiva was half Apache, the daughter of a laundress who had died the previous winter. The girl had a habit of disappearing for days at a time, returning with the smell of campfire smoke in her hair and new beads braided into her wrist. Lyra had followed her trail out into the desert, not because she was brave, because she was stubborn. She wasn't a woman built for waiting. The trouble was, she had found Tiva, and along with the girl she had found everything else. One of the men stepped forward. He wasn't the tallest. He wasn't even the broadest. Yet the others shifted just enough to make it clear that he was the one who mattered. There was something about him, not just the rifle resting easily in his hand, not the line of paint dividing his face, not the still posture of a man who had nothing left to prove. It was all of it together, and something deeper still. Something Lyra couldn't name. His name was Cota, though she would not learn that until much later. He studied her with the calm patience of someone who believed difficult things deserved proper time. Lyra held his gaze. It was the hardest thing she had done in 24 years, and she had done plenty of hard things. When he spoke in Apache, she didn't understand every word, but she caught enough. He had asked whether she was foolish or brave, so she answered again with her imperfect pronunciation and misplaced tone that she was not afraid to die. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, more like the quiet acknowledgement of something unexpected. In that moment, Lyra understood one thing with certainty. He was going to let her live. What she didn't understand, what would take weeks to unravel, was that the decision he had just made was far more complicated than that. The warriors left before the sun had dropped 2 fingers toward the horizon. They took Tiva with them. The girl went willingly. She never once looked back. That hurt more than Lyra expected. It told her something about where the child truly belonged. They left Lyra standing beside her horse, her supplies untouched, with a strange feeling that she had brushed against something enormous, something she didn't yet understand. Cota was the last to leave. Before disappearing among the rocks, he turned once more in the saddle and looked at her again. Lyra remained perfectly still until the last echo of hooves vanished into the canyon. Then she stayed standing a little longer, just to be certain her legs still worked. She rode back to the fort at dusk. She told them she had found Tiva. She said the girl was safe. She did not say the rest. Lyra had learned long ago that the entire truth is not always kind to the person who tells it. The second time she saw him was 3 weeks later. She had ridden out that morning to gather herbs for Eleanor Pike. The commander's wife brewed sagebrush tea for her headaches, and Lyra had discovered the plants growing in a shallow fold of land an hour west of the fort. It was supposed to be a simple errand. She had promised to return before noon. He was already there when she arrived, sitting on a sun-warmed rock, as though he had known she would come. Maybe he had. Lyra halted her horse and stayed still for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she swung down from the saddle. Remaining mounted felt too much like cowardice, and she hadn't ridden an hour through dust and stone just to behave like one. She gathered the herbs, slowly, carefully acting as if he were not there. He said nothing. He simply watched. But it wasn't the kind of watching she expected. There was no hostility, no calculating coldness. It was attention, complete and quiet attention. So focused that Lyra suddenly felt every movement of her own hands. When she finished and stepped toward her horse, he finally spoke. In English. "You came back." His words were careful, heavy with accent, yet precise, like someone who had learned the language deliberately and weighed every syllable before releasing it. Lyra turned toward him. "I believe I'm the one who ought to say that." Something passed briefly across his face. "You learned our words," he said. It wasn't a question. Some of them she replied. The wrong ones mostly. The difficult ones, he said. The wrong ones come easier. Lyra studied him for a moment longer than any glance she had ever given another person. "How do you know English, a priest?" he answered. "Long ago." The tone made it clear that the subject was finished. Lyra recognized that tone well. She used the same one when people asked about Tennessee. "Do you usually watch this territory?" she asked. "Sometimes. And today I came to see if you would return." Lyra said nothing. Some answers were truer when left unspoken. She mounted her horse and adjusted her hat. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lyra." "And yours?" He said his name first in Apache, fast natural, shaped the way the name belonged in his own language. Then he translated it slowly into English. "Cota." Lyra repeated it quietly. He answered her next sentence in Spanish, as if he had already guessed she knew the language. She rode away without replying, but the hand holding the reins was no longer as steady as it should have been. When Eleanor Pike asked why the errand had taken so long, Lyra said she had gotten turned around in the hills. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had gotten lost, just not in the land. That night, beneath the soft glow of lamplight, while she corrected arithmetic notebooks, Lyra found herself thinking about him. not the way a respectable woman from Tennessee ought to think about a man who had once aimed a rifle at her. But the way a woman thinks when something shifts inside her, and she doesn't yet understand why. She thought about the precision of his English, the way he treated every word as though it carried weight. She thought about his stillness, the quiet confidence of a man who had no need to impress anyone. Before the thoughts could travel too far, she forced them to stop. That was a skill Lyra Boone had learned years ago. Lyra Boone lowered the lamp flame and let the darkness take the room. She stretched out on the narrow bed and listened to the wind scraping across the Arizona night. It sounded nothing like the wind back in Tennessee. That one had been softer, thick with trees and river valleys. This wind was wide and dry, carrying the emptiness of miles of desert in every gust. She had once loved the Tennessee wind. Over time, she had learned to understand this one too. At the fort, there was a man named Garrick Sloan who had decided he admired Lyra in a way she had never encouraged. Sloan was tall, straight-backed, the sort of man whose uniform made him look even more certain of himself than he already was. He believed with quiet confidence that his interest alone should be reason enough for hers. By his own measure of patience, he had waited 2 full months. That afternoon, while seated at the dinner table in Thaddeus Pike's house, Sloan finally spoke plainly. He had already discussed the matter with the commander. His intentions had been formally acknowledged, and should Lyra agree, a proper courtship would begin leading toward marriage before the year ended. Lyra listened to every word. When he finished, she answered with the same calm certainty she had once used when speaking Apache before 5 armed warriors. She thanked him for his intentions and declined them. Color rushed into Sloan's face. Commander Thaddeus Pike shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Eleanor Pike studied the tablecloth as though it had suddenly become very interesting. Miss Boone Sloan said carefully, in the voice of a man convinced he was being reasonable, "Your situation here is not exactly—" "I understand my situation perfectly well, Captain." Her voice held no anger. That made it worse. It was precise, controlled, like someone who had chosen each word with care. "Thank you," she added. The evening ended poorly. Still, Lyra had endured worse things in her life. What she did not expect was what happened the next morning. Captain Sloan visited the commander and repeated the story of her encounter with the desert warriors. Nothing he said was technically false, but truth, when arranged carefully, can resemble something entirely different. Commander Pike called her into his office. The conversation was brief and direct. Until the matter with the Apache was clarified, Lyra would no longer be permitted to leave the fort alone on errands. She left the office without protest and walked straight to the schoolroom. The children were waiting, and children should never pay the price for decisions made by adults. Still, something inside her changed that day. It was not anger. It was older than that. It was the quiet knowledge she had carried with her all the way from Tennessee, that the world has subtle ways of shrinking a woman who refuses to behave as expected. Back in Tennessee, she had learned something else as well. The world can only shrink those who allow it. He came to the fort a few days later. Not with warriors, not with rifles, not with war paint. He rode in alone. Cota stopped his horse at the main gate and asked in steady English to speak with Commander Thaddeus Pike. Lyra knew before anyone came to tell her. Something shifted in the air of the fort the moment he arrived, a strange stillness, like a held breath shared by everyone present. She stood at the classroom window with chalk in her hand, staring across the yard. "Miss Boone, are you all right?" one of the children asked. "Yes," she said quietly. She continued the lesson, though the corner of her eye remained fixed on the courtyard. The conversation between Cota and the commander lasted more than an hour. Silas Crow, a soldier who had picked up Apache during an earlier posting, acted as interpreter. From the classroom window, Lyra could see him struggling from time to time, pausing mid-sentence as he searched for the correct word. Cota never rushed him. He waited calmly, every time silent and patient, allowing Silas to find his way through the language. After the meeting ended and Cota rode away, Eleanor Pike found Lyra in the kitchen. "The Apache chief came here to speak about you," she said, trying to sound neutral and failing slightly. Lyra slowly placed her cup on the table. "What did he say?" "He told George you behaved with honor during the encounter. He said if there were doubts about your character, he had come to settle them himself." Eleanor hesitated before continuing. "George found himself in a rather delicate position. A Soren leader riding into the fort to defend a schoolteacher isn't exactly an everyday occurrence." "No," Lyra said softly. "It certainly isn't." "Do you know who he is?" "I know his name. That's more than most people here know." Eleanor studied her for a moment. "He also asked permission to meet with you properly. George said he would need time to consider." Lyra looked out the kitchen window. The sun was low and long shadows stretched across the dusty yard. "And Captain Sloan?" she asked. "George spoke with him as well," Eleanor replied. "A very different sort of conversation." 3 days later, Commander Pike gave his answer. The meetings would be allowed with conditions. They would take place in the courtyard in daylight, with a soldier discreetly nearby, and they would not be overly long. It was the sort of compromise a careful man makes when he wants to say yes without appearing to change his mind. Cota arrived the next morning. Lyra waited on a wooden bench in the courtyard, hands folded in her lap hat resting neatly on her head. She had worn the finest dress she owned, a dark blue one that had belonged to her mother, Lyra Boone. Over the years, she had altered it many times to fit her growing frame. It was the dress she wore whenever she wanted to remember she had once been more than simply useful. Cota dismounted and stood before her for a moment before taking the bench opposite. There was no hesitation in him, only that familiar stillness, like a man entirely comfortable with silence. Lyra spoke first. "Why did you come to the commander?" "Because someone said things about you that were not true." "How did you know I have eyes in places the fort does not?" He paused. "And because I watched you walk toward my warriors and refused to step back. A person with that kind of courage should not have their name twisted." Lyra studied him carefully. "You rode all the way here for that?" "Yes." "And if Commander Pike had refused to listen?" The corner of his mouth moved slightly, the same almost smile she remembered from their first meeting. "I would have found another way." The certainty in his voice opened something inside her that had been closed for years. Not hope. Something older than hope. Recognition. They sat quietly for a moment. Across the courtyard, Silas Crow stared very hard in the opposite direction, pretending not to notice them. "Why did you learn Apache?" Cota asked. "Because I needed to find a child," Lyra answered, "and I didn't want to frighten her." "You learned a language for a child. I learned a few words badly. The difficult ones." "Yes." He almost smiled again. "Most people learn the easy ones first. I already knew those." She paused. "Well, that may not be entirely true." The lie sounded respectable enough. Cota studied her face for a long moment. For the first time since she had met him, something in his expression softened something more open, as though a quiet door inside him had shifted. "You are amusing," he said. Only occasionally, Lyra replied. Most of the time I'm terribly serious. You seem to make that difficult. I know why. She didn't ask him to explain. Some things sound better without translation. The meetings continued. At first, once a week, then twice. Soon, often enough, that Commander Thaddeus Pike stopped pretending to count them. They always sat in the courtyard. Silas Crow always hovered somewhere nearby, trying very hard to appear invisible. Sometimes Cota brought small things with him. A piece of honeycombed quartz from a canyon wall, a hawk feather. Once a bundle of herbs Lyra had casually mentioned weeks earlier while talking about the children's winter coughs. She hadn't expected him to remember. But Cota listened to everything, and Lyra began teaching him new words. Cota taught her words as well. Without either of them realizing it, a strange sort of game began between them. Lyra Boone would search for the hardest thought she could attempt in Apache. Cota would answer by choosing the hardest thing he could say in English. Not words that twisted the tongue, but words that twisted the heart. One afternoon, she asked him quietly, "How do you say, 'I am afraid' in Apache?" Cota watched her for a moment before answering. "Why would you say it?" "Not often," Lyra replied after a pause. "But more often than I used to." She knew he understood what she meant. He was not asking about language. He was asking about them, about whatever slow and dangerous thing had begun to grow between them. Lyra didn't explain further. She simply tucked the phrase away in her mind, the way a person stores things that matter. Winter settled across the territory colder and drier than anyone expected. The children in the schoolhouse began coughing exactly as Lyra had predicted, and the herbs Cota had brought from the canyon proved more useful than anyone at the fort had imagined. Lyra wrote him a small note in Apache to thank him. She used a grammar book that Silas Crow had once lent her, and sent the message quietly through one of the soldiers. The following week, she received a reply. The writing was in English, broad and deliberate. Each letter had been shaped carefully, as if the act of writing demanded effort and deserved it. The message said, "You are cold at night." It wasn't written as a question. Lyra spent half the night wondering whether the sentence carried concern or presumption. Eventually, she decided it was concern. That realization unsettled her far more. She sent back a single answer. "Yes." His reply came the next day. "That is not right." Lyra answered once more. "I agree completely." The next morning, there was a blanket folded neatly outside her door. It hadn't arrived through the soldiers. Someone had placed it there personally. A small blue bead rested in the fold of the fabric. There was no note. None was necessary. Lyra stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold hallway air drifting past her, while she held the blanket against her arms. Something inside her, something that had remained firm for years, began to loosen, not because she was weak. It loosened the way tightly bound rope finally slackens after being pulled too long. Sometimes surrender is another form of courage. She had once walked straight toward a line of armed warriors to protect a child. She had done it without calculation, guided only by the stubborn instinct inside her that always moved forward, even when common sense said stop. That was what Cota had seen first. Before her copper-colored hair, before the warm gray of her eyes, before the stubborn set of her mouth. He had seen that instinct, and he had come all the way to the fort because of it. The herbs, the quartz stones, the hawk feather. And now this blanket. It carried the faint scent of wood smoke and something deeper she could not quite name, though she recognized it immediately. It smelled like safety. A well-bred woman from Tennessee was not supposed to cry over a blanket left by an Apache man. But Lyra Boone had stopped being merely well-bred a long time ago. Tennessee was very far away. She allowed herself a few quiet tears. Then she went to teach her class. The conversation that changed everything happened early in February. The wind was too fierce that afternoon for sitting in the courtyard, so Commander Thaddeus Pike, with a sigh that held equal parts reluctance and generosity, allowed them to use one of the meeting rooms. Silas Crow stood outside the door. Lyra could hear him whistling softly. Inside the room, she asked, "Do you have family?" "I had a brother," Cota answered. He paused. 3 years ago. "I know what that means," Lyra said quietly. "And I think you know that I know." She studied him. "You seem to know things about me that you shouldn't. I have eyes in places the fort does not." "Yes." She hesitated. "That should trouble me," she admitted. "And yet, it doesn't. What does that say about me?" "It says you trust me." The answer was simple. As simple as the honeycombed quartz stone he had once placed in her hand. Lyra looked at him carefully. "Does that frighten you?" "Yes." He didn't hesitate, but not as much as it would if it were otherwise. Silence filled the room. Outside, Silas kept whistling. Lyra spoke again, though she did not finish the thought. "What will happen?" There were too many ways to complete that sentence. None of them were easy. "With us?" Cota asked. "With what this is becoming." He watched her steadily. There was no avoidance in his gaze, no attempt to soften the truth or shrink the moment. "I do not know what will happen," he said finally. "But I know what I want to happen." He paused. "I want you." The words were simple, unadorned. Not these visits, not meetings watched by soldiers. "I want you truly. What that means for two people with the world we have between us, I do not know yet." His voice remained calm. "But when I imagine the future, you are there." Lyra sat quietly with those words. Then she answered, "I am afraid too. I know. And I know what I want as well." She said slowly, "I just don't know yet whether I have the courage to take it." Cota's mouth moved slightly, almost forming a smile. "You spoke broken Apache to 5 armed warriors without knowing whether you would live through it," he said. "You have courage. What you do not have yet is certainty that I deserve it." Lyra opened her mouth to protest. Then she closed it again. "I am not criticizing you," he continued gently. "You are right to wait. Certainty is harder to earn than courage." She studied him. "How did you earn my courage?" That faint, almost smile appeared again. "It was waiting at your door," he said. Lyra held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, like someone making a decision she understood completely, she reached across the table. Her hand rested on top of his. Nothing more. Her palm covered the back of his hand. His skin was darker, his hand larger. Cota did not move. He stayed perfectly still beneath her touch, as if he had waited long enough to understand that sudden movement might frighten the moment away. Outside the room, Silas Crow continued whistling. The wind rattled against the window. Neither of them moved. It was never going to be simple. Both of them understood that. They spoke about it with a kind of honesty that only becomes possible when two people stop pretending that life is easier than it truly is. In March, Garrick Sloan requested a transfer away from the fort. Commander Thaddeus Pike wrote a letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs that he later described as a statement of practical sense, one that might very well cost him his next promotion. Eleanor Pike brewed tea one afternoon and sat beside Lyra. "There are some matters," she said gently, "that belong to no one's business, but the people living them." She looked out at the vast desert beyond the fort. "And this territory is wide enough for people who need a little room." In April, Tiva returned. She carried a basket of wildflowers and a message. The words were written in Apache. Lyra did not need to ask who had sent them. The message said, "She is under my protection for as long as she wishes to remain." Lyra spent the afternoon teaching Tiva how to add fractions. That evening, she translated the message into English. Later that night, she lay awake beneath the blanket that smelled faintly of wood smoke and safe ground. Years earlier, she had walked into the desert without hesitation, offering herself to armed warriors in order to protect a child. She had acted on instinct. That instinct, the one thing inside her that had always proven trustworthy. Cota had seen it immediately. He understood something she had not yet fully realized herself. Some things in life are impossible. Others are merely difficult. The difficult things require patience, and two people willing to walk carefully across unfamiliar ground. Lyra Boone was 24 years old. She had long ago learned that tears do not change what has already happened. But during that winter of herbs, quartz stones, and a blanket left quietly at her door, she learned something else. Some things change without tears at all. They arrive slowly, carefully, the way a man chooses each word, only after weighing its cost, because silence in the end can cost even more. The following morning, Lyra stood in the courtyard when Cota arrived. The rising sun stretched across the Arizona desert, turning the land gold in every direction. He stepped down from his horse and walked toward her, and stood there. He stood before her, and Lyra Boone saw that familiar stillness in his face again. By now she understood what it meant. It was not emptiness. It was presence, the quiet strength of a man who had already proved what he was, and had no need to prove anything further. "Good morning," Lyra said in Apache. Her tone was still wrong. The consonant softened where it should have been sharp. Cota's expression changed. A slow smile spread across his face, wide, genuine, warming the stillness around him, the way the morning sun warms stone after a cold desert night. It was the first full smile Lyra had ever seen from him. In that moment, she understood something simple and undeniable. She had been the one to draw it out. Perhaps from the very first moment among those canyon rocks, they had already been doing this for one another. Pulling hidden things into the open, bringing forward parts of themselves the world had kept buried. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The Arizona morning stretched wide and bright around them. The desert wind moved gently through the fort yard. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifted its weight against a hitching rail. Lyra felt the quiet certainty settle inside her. Some stories do not begin with thunder. Some begin with a single word spoken badly in the wrong language, and someone who chooses to hear the meaning anyway. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal, barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.